Hello everyone. Today, we will continue our in-depth analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war in the fourth video of the video series, Breaking Point in the Russia-Ukraine War. It can be seen that the question is, did Putin and the Russian forces fail? To answer this question, let's watch this video together. While watching the video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and leave your comments so we can be motivated to serve you better. Sincerely thank. When the conflict began, about 15,000 Russian troops, accounting for 15% of the total force, quickly entered Ukraine, controlling a large area of up to 30,000 square kilometers and approaching two major cities, Kiev and Kharkiv. This event is not only the focus of diplomatic activities between the West and Putin but also attracts the attention of the whole world. However, with a very low military density, each Russian soldier had to capture and defend 2 square kilometers. Russian forces in Kiev and Kharkov suffered many losses due to the Ukrainian army's guerrilla tactics, arousing confidence that the Russian army was much weaker and that their front would soon collapse. Meanwhile, about 85% of Russia's troops, concentrated mainly in Crimea, successfully broke through the defense line of Ukraine to isolate Crimea and completely defeat the country's southern army. The first phase of the war ended when Russian troops from southern Crimea advanced more than 360 kilometers to surround the main force of the southern Ukrainian army in Mariupol. Meanwhile, the troops from Donbass and Russia also took the same amount of time to advance a distance equal to 1/6 of that of the Crimean army, which is 60 kilometers. There were 3 main events that marked the end of the first phase of this war. First, Russian forces succeeded in defeating Ukraine's navy and air force in the southern region. The military expert who controlled the Kherson region used the western bank of the Dnieper River as a strategic springboard to attack Odessa. The second event was the withdrawal of Russian troops from the northern front, including the Kharkov area, to deploy troops to Donbass, and this was also the first time Russia introduced a unified command mechanism for the armed forces in Ukraine. The third event is the shift in diplomacy of NATO countries, from fear of Ukraine collapsing to determination to support Ukraine in fighting against Russia. The strongest sanctions have been by Western countries implemented, and they believe that the Russian economy will soon fall into crisis, forcing Moscow to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. The second phase of the war begins from April 2022 to July 2022. This phase can be divided into 2 smaller parts. The first phase from April to May 2022, when Russia established the Ministry of Unified Military Command in Ukraine. During this period, Ukrainian security forces arrested Viktor Medvedchuk, after many days of hiding, a leader of the pro-Russian opposition party, who is expected to head the new Ukrainian government if the military Zelensky's successful coup team. After ending the campaign in Mariupol, Russian troops suddenly withdrew from the front in Kiev and Kharkov. During this retreat, for the first time they used the ISDM automatic demining system, a multiple-barrel multiple-launcher capable of clearing a minefield from a distance of 5 to 15 kilometers in a single shot. This demining was carried out systematically to prevent pursuing Ukrainian forces, and Ukrainian forces were also careful not to chase the Russians. In 2 weeks, all Russian forces withdrawn from the Kiev front had almost disappeared from the battlefield. Many Western experts believe that these Russian military units were severely weakened by Ukrainian forces, to the extent that they needed several months to recover. However, after only 2 weeks, these same units advanced from Russia through Donbass along the route south of Kharkov. During those 2 weeks, they traveled a distance of 1,500 kilometers, while resupplying ammunition and fuel, and then immediately entered combat. Over the next month and a half, this force captured an area of about 4,000 square kilometers south of Kharkov. Their greatest success was the capture of Izium. After a month and a half of fighting, the loss of Izium led to the complete cutting off of the M03 highway, connecting Kharkov with Sloviansk, all the way to Bakhmut in the Donbass region. The map below shows the side's front lines on April 2, 2022, with Russian-controlled or Ukrainian-controlled areas shown in red and a diagonal red stripe extending from Kiev to Kharkov. Moving to figure H3, the battle lines of the parties on June 21, 2022 show that the Russians left the area outlined in yellow there to take over 4,000 square kilometers in South Kharkov, the area outlined in green. As an aside, regarding the issue of calculating losses, since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians have used a propaganda method by counting the number of Russian deaths on cron screens. One of the most notable videos is the one where a Ukrainian soldier counts 99,998, then 99,999, then 100,000, claiming that 100,000 Russian soldiers have died. Obviously, this approach is strongly propaganda. Like the videos of the Bakhmut's massacre, in which the bodies were said to have been lying there for 4 to 5 days, but the skin on the hands was still rosy. There was a body right in front of Western journalists who could not stand the suffocation of the body bag, so they opened the bag to breathe. Normally, data on the enemy's loss of life is collected through intelligence information. However, those methods require time to achieve results, because one of the ways to determine the enemy's damage relatively accurately and quickly is to observe the movement and the fighting ability of enemy units before and after each battle. In this campaign, we apply this method to qualitatively assess Russian losses on the Kiev front, by observing the movements and combat readiness of units withdrawn from this front. About Donbass. We know that the Russian Kiev army took 2 weeks to travel 1,500 kilometers from Kiev to Russia through Belgorod and then into South Kharkov, at an average speed of about 100 kilometers per day. With such a short time and such a long distance, it is necessary to promptly repair damaged artillery vehicles, refuel and replenish ammunition along the way, as well as prepare a starting line for this army and reserve ammunition, medicine and fuel at the Russian border to provide reinforcements after entering Donbass, which was a logistical feat. That time is too short to add new troops and train new recruits to become familiar with the unit's operating methods. If the units of this, Russian, Kiev army suffered 40 to 80% damage as the Western press said, then they would not have had the ability to move over such long distances and to replenish troops. Numbers and training will take several months. That means, if this army had additional troops during the 2-week march, it would only be a very small number. Meanwhile, when entering Donbass, Ukrainian troops encountered a large force of well-trained Russian troops ready to fight Ukraine. Please note that during the 8 years of war between the two separatist republics, the main forces of Ukraine were concentrated in the Donbass region and the south. However, after only a month and a half, the Russian army from Kiev succeeded in capturing Izium and cutting off the strategic Kharkov to Bakhmut's transport route. This shows that the Russian army's losses on the Kiev front are insignificant, allowing them to still maintain strength to carry out difficult tasks in May and June 2022. We can refer to the map during this early period. It was seen that under the leadership of veteran General Dvornikov, commander-in-chief of Russian troops in Ukraine, the Russians adopted an effective military strategy and tactics that they continue to use to this day. This strategy includes 3 main elements. First, maximize the destruction of the enemy's vital forces and minimize losses to your side. Second, destroy the enemy's military potential thoroughly and systematically, ensuring that the enemy cannot recover in both force and military potential for a long time. Third, do not set short-term political goals in military matters. We need to emphasize here that the Western press has and continues to portray the Russian army and its conduct of war as another version of the Soviet army. The strategy and tactics of the Soviet Army itself have been misunderstood by the Western press and Western intellectuals since World War II, with the view that the Soviet Army won mainly thanks to numbers. Not numbers. Not thanks to the art of combat command. In fact, the Soviet Army won not only by numbers but also by the merciless sacrifice of its soldiers. They often like to depict the image of Red Army soldiers shoulder to shoulder, marching side by side through minefields to open the way for the units behind them to advance, despite these events being approved by Nazi generals. Who lost and recounted in his memoirs the 1960s and 1970s, described at a time when the Cold War and opposition to the Soviet Union were at their peak. It was these generals who created the legend of the Polish cavalry charging with bayonets and shields, and the German tank formation in 1939. Meanwhile, Western military academies admitted that the Berdyansk campaign in the Red Army's 1944 campaign was conducted most perfectly in every aspect. This operation broke the German army center by 1 million troops and opened the way for the Red Army to advance into Poland and eventually to Berlin. This campaign and the subsequent offensives created the largest and longest voluntary prisoner of war camp of World War II, the siege of 320,000 German troops in Latvia's Kurland from July 1944 to when Germany surrendered to the Allies in April 1945. It should be noted that the two most famous campaigns of the Allies and the Soviet Union during the Second World War were the Allied Tunisia campaign and the Stalingrad campaign, which only encircled and 250,000 troops were surrendered during the Tunisian campaign and 280,000 troops were besieged and 98,000 troops were captured during the Stalingrad campaign. Another Red Army campaign that NATO military schools also considered a model of offensive movement was the Manchurian attack, in which the Red Army defeated 1.5 million Japanese and Allied troops in one campaign. Lasted almost a month. Although this campaign is considered a forgotten campaign by the general public, anyone who studies the military knows that the Manchurian campaign was the most successful campaign in human history, with time the shortest success, the least loss to the attacker and the most damage to the defender, over the widest geographical scale. The point that attracted the most public attention was the siege of Mariupol and the eventual surrender of Ukrainian troops at the Azovstal plant. This strategy shows that the Russian army has consumed the most of the enemy's life force with the least cost of blood on its own side. Except for the first reconnaissance unit that entered Mariupol and was ambushed in the city, we can search online for video of the ambush of the two leading Russian T-72 tanks. After that, the Russians conducted a tight siege and slowly tightened it like the way a python curls up and gradually squeezes its prey to the point of suffocation. The siege of Mariupol, which is reminiscent of the siege of Grozny in 1999 during the Second Chechen War. Similar to Grozny, after creating humanitarian corridors for civilians to withdraw from the city, Russian troops formed a wide encirclement and entered the center from all directions without haste. Russian units have continuously used reconnaissance UAVs to calibrate artillery. Russian infantry units advanced only after Ukrainian targets had been weakened by Russian artillery. The tightening of the Russian encirclement has caused Ukrainian forces to stretch across the entire defense line, because they do not know exactly where the main target of the Russian attack is. This problem has resulted in greater attrition of Ukrainian forces due to Russian artillery. At the beginning of the war, Ukrainian troops were proud to own Turkish UAVs, each costing about $5 million, and they laughed at Russian-made UAVs. Ukrainian intelligence posted on social networks a video dissecting a captured Russian UAV, in which they pointed out that the Russians used Japanese Canon civilian cameras costing $500, mounted on the UAVs. Produced simply. Even the gas tank is made by reusing used Coca-Cola bottles. After 8 years of NATO training, Ukrainian soldiers believe they are fighting with more modern, more expensive weapons than Russian troops. However, in war, the efficiency factor is more important. The number of Turkish UAVs that Ukraine had stockpiled before the war was quickly depleted due to Russian air defense forces shooting them down, and the replenishment of these large, expensive UAVs could not be done quickly, especially when Ukraine depends on financial aid from abroad. Meanwhile, cheap Russian UAVs began to dominate the battlefield. The design and use of UAVs by Turkey and Russia shows that the military theory and use of UAVs in these two countries are completely different. The Russians use two main forces, the Air Force and the Navy, along with missiles, of which missiles are the most powerful developed weapon. They have many types of missiles serving different purposes, from intercontinental strategic missiles carrying nuclear warheads to long-range, medium-range, and short-range missiles with conventional warheads. Their missiles can be equipped with forces on the ground, on warships and submarines, on aircraft, and can be launched from long distances or right at the front. Currently, missiles are the most dangerous and safest weapons for attackers that Russia possesses. In addition to missiles, the Russian Air Force also uses bombs, from smart bombs to conventional bombs. Turkey, a country that does not possess a strong air force, navy, or missile force, chose to develop large-sized UAV devices to attack targets at medium-range distances. These UAVs carry short-range missiles because Turkey cannot yet produce long-range missiles. Because there were not enough aircraft to carry these missiles and in order to minimize damage to the Air Force due to the short range, the pilots had to fly into the area controlled by enemy air defenses. For that reason, the Turks created the large UAV Bayraktar TB2, a product that meets this need. In short, Turkey's UAV is a flying device with a low flight ceiling, slow speed and a small amount of weapons carried compared to fighter aircraft. If used against opponents without good air defense systems, this is an extremely effective weapon. However, in Ukraine, after the first victories of the Bayraktar TB2, the Russians deployed a multi-level, multi-layered air defense system. After this system was deployed, Bayraktar TB2 disappeared from the fight. On the Russian side, while medium and long-range attack missions are assigned to missiles, Russian UAVs are mainly used for frontline reconnaissance, providing real-time intelligence and precision attacks at targets beyond artillery range. It was this cheap Russian frontline reconnaissance UAV that Ukrainian intelligence officers laughed at the beginning of the war. However, in Mariupol, the first battle showed the effectiveness of the cheap UAVs used by Russia. With low cost, these reconnaissance UAVs are widely equipped with many infantry and artillery units. This causes the Ukrainian defense force in Mariupol to be increasingly narrowed, being monitored almost continuously 24/7. All counterattacks by the Ukrainian army were stopped from the beginning. Ukrainian units surrounded at the Azovstal steel plant made 3 attempts to break out. The first time, they disguised their motor vehicles as Russian vehicles by painting the letter Z on them, but this siege failed and they had to return to the factory. In the second time, Russian UAVs detected Ukrainian troops moving from underground bunkers to the surface to prepare for a siege. The Russians for the first time in the war used strategic bombers Tu-22M3 to bomb, forcing Ukrainian troops to retreat underground. The third time, when the situation underground became unbearable due to Russian troops destroying the water supply, Ukrainian troops had to go above ground to prepare for the final siege. This time, the Russians fired cluster incendiary bullets on the entire factory, causing the siege to break up before it could be deployed. A few days later, Ukrainian troops surrendered. The use of Russian UAVs costing only a few $1,000s has brought amazing results, showing that even seemingly outdated weapons can be very powerful. Few people know that the 152 Ly and 130 milliliters cannons that Water's private army has been using in Bakhmut for many months are mostly artillery boxes produced by the Soviet Union in the 1950s. However, on the battlefield, adjusting the firing paths of UAVs has made ancient cannons, up to 70 years old, still have destructive power no less than modern cannons. The nature of the weapon is the same, whether infantry or armored forces. When hit by a 152 mm artillery shell from a 70-year-old cannon, death is no different from death from a newly manufactured cannon. Released in 2020. The absence of Russian UAVs in the first month of the war led many to believe that Russia was not strong in this field. However, we know that the military that uses UAVs the most today is not the US military but the Chinese military. China is also currently the leading power in the production and development of civil and military UAVs, both in quantity, type and quality. Joint exercises between the Russian and Chinese armies in the last 5 to 7 years have shown that Russian generals are very clear about the superiority of UAVs in combat command. However, in the first month of the war, when the Russian army relied mainly on mobilization, the role of UAVs was not highly appreciated. Only when they began to conduct battlefield battles did the role of UAVs become prominent. The siege of Mariupol shows that Russia's method of fighting against Ukraine's strong defensive positions is not to use infantry to attack directly, but to choose a siege method, using air reconnaissance to detect present Ukrainian concentration points, and then use maximum artillery fire to deplete enemy forces. Armored units will provide fire support for the infantry as they advance to clear each block. During the siege of Mariupol, on average a day the Russian army used up to 40,000 heavy artillery shells, a number equal to half the total number of large artillery shells used by the South Vietnamese Liberation Army during the entire war. Ho Chi Minh epidemic in 1975 in Vietnam. Reading this, you will probably tell me that there are many videos in which Russian troops carry out attacks carelessly. I do not deny the authenticity of those videos, but I want to emphasize that they do not reflect Russia's general military strategy in any war. Every period of war has had bad commanders or battles where the commander's decisions were wrong, and the videos you see belong to that type of case. However, taken as a whole, we can see that the Russians, as they moved into Phase 2 and beyond, maximized the use of firepower to save the lives of their troops. What is notable about the 2-month siege of Mariupol is that those who are worried about the caution in the Russian army's actions are not Putin or the Russian command, but the Western press and observers. Like us. The Western press hoped that the Russians would act impulsively, rush into the factory and fight in dozens of kilometers of tunnels under the factory, because that would be a perfect scenario for their propaganda. In this scenario, Ukrainian soldiers will fight to the last bullet and only surrender when they run out of bullets, while Russian generals will be criticized for sacrificing their soldiers in vain to please an unjust dictator. Reason: they wanted that and even did everything to make it happen, especially when May 9th, the Victory Day over Nazi Germany in Russia, approached, and the Western press raced to report that a war would take place. The attack will break out and the Russian army will defy all sacrifices to capture the Azovstal factory before that day. In fact, nothing like that happened. On Victory Day, Russian troops still watched the military parade on Red Square via TV and watched Azovstal via UAV. Every time there was movement on the ground in the factory, they gave the Ukrainian army a storm of bullets. In the end, the Ukrainian army surrendered without a heroic final battle. The siege of Mariupol is a typical example of Russia's solid and energy-saving combat strategy in the war in Ukraine. From May 16, 2022, Ukrainian units besieged in Azovstal began to surrender, and the last Ukrainian soldiers surrendered on May 20, 2022, after the surrender of Mariupol. This leads to the question of the next direction of the main Russian force. One possibility is that they will move towards Zaporizhia in the northwest and combine with an attack from Kherson in the west to surround this city, illustrated by the dark blue line of attack in the map. For this reason, a large number of Ukrainian reserve forces were deployed to this area. However, after diversionary operations that distracted Ukraine's assessment, the Russian army advanced around Donetsk and attacked Halyuka, encircling and destroying a Ukrainian army group of about 4,000 people there. Finally, along with the ground forces from Kiev that had moved here 2 months earlier, they joined the Ukrainian army in siege at Severodonetsk. A string of victories in Russia's Halyuka, Severodonetsk and Lugansk. Many notable things happened on the Ukrainian side after the loss of Mariupol. The Ukrainian military command and President Zelensky began to have serious conflicts that became public in February and early March 2022. After Russian troops broke through the Crimea blockade line and in turn occupied cities along the Azov coast, everyone realized that the Russians were establishing a terrestrial corridor to connect Crimea with Russia. Although the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea and Russia has been completed since 2020, if this bridge is destroyed, Crimea will be cut off from Russia's Taman Peninsula. At this time, Mariupol is Ukraine's last block to prevent Russia from establishing an indestructible bridge on the ground from Crimea. Establishing this land bridge is also one of Russia's top public goals, with both political and military significance. However, in theory, the Ukrainian Army Command understood that, after the Southern Red Army of Ukraine was defeated and lost Kherson, the ability to retake Crimea was impossible. At least they no longer had any forces available for this purpose. Politically, the Ukrainian command believes that protecting what remains of the southern front would be more politically beneficial than sacrificing it, which would thwart Putin's political goals. For this reason, they propose to abandon Mariupol. As for Zelensky, after his success in bringing Russia to the negotiating table to buy time and the fact that Russia has reduced the intensity of missile attacks and suspended operations on the Kiev front after the West changed its attitude regime and began supplying weapons to Ukraine as well as implementing embargo measures. When Zelensky becomes a bright politician in world politics, withdrawing from Mariupol will be a major political failure for him in the context of negotiations. Once the Russians have established a ground corridor connecting Crimea, their negotiating conditions will become tougher and the West may rethink its support for Ukraine. For these reasons, Zelensky firmly refused to agree to the withdrawal. By this time, he may have been excited by the successes on the diplomatic front and did not realize that in the south of Ukraine, the Russians are not joking, they are waging a truly merciless, unrelenting war, affected by any negotiation process. Here's something spectacular happened. Zelensky, in order to save Kiev and Kharkov being surrounded by Russia, was determined to hold Mariupol at all costs. However, he may not have realized that Putin had been tricked by him, and was eyeing the possibility of seizing Kiev and Kharkov, a possibility that never actually existed. Can anyone believe that with 15,000 troops, Russia can capture 2 cities with nearly 4 million people and nearly 40,000 square kilometers of surrounding area? While Putin cannot capture Kharkov and Kiev, he makes Zelensky trying to hold an untenable city, Mariupol, along with Ukraine's most elite forces in the south. The Ukrainian military command noticed Putin's plan, but they could not convince Zelensky and therefore the conflict between them became even more acute after the fall of Mariupol. Disagreement between the Ukrainian military command and Zelensky over whether to retreat or entrench in locations such as Popasna, Severodonetsk and Luhansk is increasing. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army openly expressed to the press the possibility of being surrounded by Russian troops and the president's refusal to allow withdrawal. During this time, the physical and spiritual collapse of Ukraine's Donbass army became obvious. In May 2022, Ukrainian troops won a resounding victory when they crushed a Russian army crossing the Dnieper River from Kiev. During this river crossing, due to the mistake of the Russian commander, the Russian side suffered heavy losses in both people and tanks and armored vehicles. However, this victory continued and the Ukrainian army crossed the river to counterattack in the opposite direction and were again severely hit by the Russian army. It is worth mentioning that when Ukrainian forces crossed the river to counterattack at that time, a large number of recruits were mobilized in the fourth phase in March and April 2022. Ukraine conducted 4 rounds of general mobilization and fourth wave recruits with less than 3 weeks of training were sent into a river crossing under direct enemy fire, one of the most difficult operations of the war and usually carried out by soldiers. The most skilled unit. However, at the end of May 2022, the Ukrainians launched new recruits into this mission. This may have been due to the commander's irresponsibility, but perhaps Ukraine had run out of forces-friendly combatants in previous battles in June and July 2022. This has appeared many videos of Ukrainian units on social networks to avoid being charged with treason. They published videos with all soldiers in unit to talk about the lack of weapons and ammunition, abandoned by the commander, as a basis for refusing to execute combat orders on all 3 fronts Popasna, Severodonetsk and Luhansk. All withdrew when surrounded almost closing. Therefore, they suffered great losses on the way to retreat and some units that could not withdraw in time were forced to surrender. After Luhansk fell and Phase 2 of the war ended, the conflict between the president and the command seriously arose again. However, the conflict this time is on the Russian side, even though they have just had a series of spectacular victories. We will discuss this issue further later, Part 6. To summarize briefly at this stage, Putin lost what he did not have, and in order to keep what Putin could not get, Zelensky lost what was truly most important in the south and east. These are elite forces that took 8 years of construction by Ukraine and unification with its army command. Part 4 will stop here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share and leave comments. Press the follow bell to receive notifications of the latest sequel.